Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 20th of March, and today we're covering the situation on the Avdiivka and Novomykhailivka fronts. We're going to begin by looking at the latest developments around Terny. And so this is on the River front. What you'll see is there was a new video released today in conjunction between three units, the 60th, 63rd, and 93rd Mechanized Brigades. These units at least have a partial presence on this section of the front line. For instance, 93rd also has elements around Bakhmut. But generally what you see in the video is there is a armored vehicle coming from the Russian side advancing along this particular dirt road. It's a well-known road that the Russians have used previously for their columns that have advanced incrementally towards Terny, taking over in the process various open fields or makeshift defensive lines. And so this road actually directly leads into Terny through this direction over here. And so the vehicle was spotted by the Ukrainian side, and it was targeted by FPV drones. At that point, once it was struck directly, the infantry that were mounted on or within the vehicle, they dismounted, and they started to really seek some sort of concealment or shelter in the nearby forested areas over here. And so these forested sections are extremely critical. When the Ukrainians had control over them, and the previous front line before I made the map changes today looked something like this. And so when the Ukrainians had control over that forested portion, they of course built makeshift trenches, but mainly dugouts. And so the Russian forces, a part of why they've been trying to advance over these past few months in Terny, is to gradually take over those Ukrainian defenses. And so in this case, once the Russian forces were able to breach the Ukrainian line and advance about 700 meters westward, or actually it's 1.3 kilometers westward. Once they were able to do that, they then set up positions within those Ukrainian built defenses. And again, once they did that, they were hit by Ukrainian FPV drones or by drones that dropped grenades onto their positions. So all in all, the Ukrainians were able to prevent the Russians from entering into Terny, but I highly doubt that was the Russian objective, only using one vehicle to do so along such an open area, an area that is at ground zero of the fighting. So again, just as with many of these other Russian assaults, starting really last year at the beginning of November, December, I think that this was just an effort to shift the front line just a little bit closer and closer to Terny in order to gradually degrade the Ukrainian defenses and create the proper geographical and really just military situation that then would be conducive for eventually taking over Terny. And I think the topographic map really proves my points. And again, it's not accurate completely, the front line I marked in red, just because I did it off the top of my head. But the main point you see is that the Russian forces have been pushing continuously through the ridges that are overlooking, first of all, their current positions on the rear around the Crimea sector, which is previously very important to secure and where the Russian forces built their lines of defense that now are not really important as they're pushing westwards. And again, more importantly, it overlooks the Ukrainian positions located on either side of the River, and especially around an area like Terny or Orlivka, which are the two villages that the Russians have approached and are now at the outskirts of. And again, they have the advantage of having the ridge overlooking both of these villages, and at that point they can move in mortar crews, again artillery fire, and just generally small arms fire from the Russian forces and reconnaissance to take advantage of that discrepancy. At the same time, the Ukrainians actually control a salient to the east of the River, located around the village of Nevske, over here to the north of Terny, and so they control certain portions of the ridge further north. And so it'll be very interesting to see if the Russian forces decide to shift some of their attention towards taking back those positions. First of all, in order to secure their current flank on the salient marked in the red square, that's one thing. But also to get control over the entirety of the ridges that are overlooking this River Valley, but also all of the logistics leading into it from Liman, for instance, which is a major Ukrainian node of defense and a command center that is generally marked with these blue lines to the southwest. And now looking forward with the Russians at the doorstep of Terny, I really don't see anything changing. I think the Russians will just continue with these certain attacks that occur every now and then. You could say every a couple days or every week or so there's a notable assault that we get proof of based on Ukrainian videos. So I think the Russians will just continue trying to one by one overrun the Ukrainian defenses and just secure the ridges in general, and then just utilize their superiority and firepower in this direction in order to squeeze the Ukrainians out. But I don't see any sort of massive ramping up in attacks here. Now, moving on to the Avdiivka front, the most interesting piece of news is the Russians fully capturing Orlivka. This was verified on the 19th of March by Deep State, and they've been tracking the battles around Orlivka and showing the Russians continually advancing, not just within the eastern sections of the village, but also in the fields to the south and to the north, really for 5 days in a row now. And so there has been sustained Russian pressure. Russian sources claim that it was actually captured on the 17th of March, but that the delay in announcing its capture for 2 days was due to Ukrainian resistance in the westernmost outskirts, but also you have the Russians trying to fully consolidate their positions. But at this point, there is no Ukrainian presence in Orlivka or in any region here to the east of the Terny River. The Ukrainian forces located in Orlivka have now withdrawn past that river and are either around the Omanske fortifications. There was a pretty sizable amount of fortifications that were built in this blue rectangle to the east of Umanske, or they're located in the ridge located to the west of Semenivka. Now, at the same time as the Russians were solidifying control of Orlivka, that also gave them an advantage in the Tonenki battle because they had control of the northern flank of that village. And so now there's a lot of talk about the Ukrainians being in the process or have already fully withdrawn from the northwestern section of Tonenki, because we know that the rest of Terny is already under Russian control, as can be shown based on my mapping over here. But there is, of course, ambiguity over this northwestern section. Some sources, as of yesterday, showed it under Ukrainian control, and we actually saw videos from the Russian side showing their utilization of artillery, MLRS fire, and FAB bombs dropping on this district, implying there were Ukrainian holdouts that were being targeted. Of course, that was earlier on today or yesterday. And so, in the time since then, it is certainly possible that the Ukrainians have been pushed out or that they decided to retreat under heavy fire through these open fields towards the prepared defenses around Umanske. I can't verify that yet with 100% certainty, but I do know that it is currently being circulated around the Russian Telegram channels that that's exactly what happened already, and the Ukrainians are already in the process of withdrawing. But in terms of the other key battle that is around Berdichi, in today's latest video coming out of the village, it was released by the Strike Drones Company of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, showing their FPV crews destroying 3 Russian BMP-3s in the southern dirt road as they were likely trying to dismount infantry to set up permanent positions in the village. And that was released today. At the same time, the Russian side released drone footage. One such video showed an FPV strike from the Russians hitting a Bradley in Semenivka. Again, these Bradleys, they are a big part of the Ukrainian defense over here. They're supposed to be these highly mobile assets that are used using their suppressive fire to target advancing Russian infantry and armor. And then we also have a video, I have it over here, also on the southern dirt road of Berdichi, which shows 2 Russian soldiers entering the destroyed Abrams tank. I think it was destroyed at the beginning of March 1st to be precise. And I have the video of the destruction located right next to it. And so now we have Russian soldiers walking in the open through Berdichi and actually reaching that Abrams. Of course, not towing it away now because of how close they are to the front line, but it shows you where those troops are present. So really what I've noticed from Berdichi in the time period following the Ukrainian counterattack, and the Ukrainian counterattack, we'd say it ended like around the first week of March. That was when it really died down. And since then, the Russians have steadily regained the initiative. And so in the 2 weeks nearly since that point in time, the Russian forces have launched a rather large volume of assaults from Stepov to Berdichi. And at first, and this was something that I tracked at the time actually, as they were advancing along the southern dirt road, they were repelled at the entrance. A lot of the times, they were able to reach a couple hundred meters into the village, but were not able to dismount troops in time and were forced out or just destroyed and had their squads eliminated, you could say. That was the initial phase, and that's when the Ukrainian defensive capacity was at its highest point. It was after they had counterattacked and when their troops had a cohesive unit within the village. And so it just makes a lot of sense that, of course, if they were also rationing artillery, then that would be used, and that they were using their vast amount of FPV drones to target the Russian forces as they're advancing, and of course the Western supplied weaponry. And so that was during the first few days. But eventually, what you see as more and more videos get posted, mainly from the Ukrainian side, showing their efforts at repelling the Russians, you see how gradually the front line and the geolocations for those videos start shifting westwards. And so over time, the Russian forces are able to send vehicles, tanks, MTLBs, directly into the southern road itself, into the residential areas, and then they're able to dismount forces. And the Ukrainians simply don't have the wherewithal to push them back in time. And so by the time that some of the vehicles are damaged, you already have troops that have dismounted, set up positions in basements and shelters and houses, and then it paves the way for additional armored assaults that are supported by the infantry. And then it's just a never-ending cycle of the Russian forces just continuing to push westward and westward, and eventually getting full control over that road, and eventually exploiting that breach to actually cross over the Terny River. And so now we're seeing the culmination of similar Russian attempts occurring on the northern road into Berdichi along this red arrow, where the Russian forces initially had failures in breaking through, but now have positions on the eastern outskirts of that road where troops have already set up positions. So it'll be interesting to see how over the next few days the Russian forces continue battling with the Ukrainians now in that northern road. So here's a topographic map of the sector. You can see that the Ukrainians currently, as is being reported by the Russian side, are pulling back to the gullies around here that are an extension of the Terny River, and then there's another extension of that gully further to the southeast that leads directly into Tonenke. And so those Ukrainian positions are located at the lowest of the low in terms of elevation. They are very exposed in that regard. And basically all of the Ukrainian positions in the southern section of this front are on rather low elevation, whether they be around Netelove, Umanske, etc. And so the Russian forces, at the same time, if they advance through this direction in efforts of trying to repel, or not repel, but overrun the Ukrainian defenses around Novomykhailivka, they would in a way be fighting an uphill battle, because they would be attacking from the lowlands, attacking towards the Ukrainian fortifications on this ridge. So of course the Russians would like to exploit the lack of Ukrainian stabilization of the front line around Tonenke, and then push towards areas like Netelove to the south, where they would actually be on similar, if not more advantageous, high ground. The other key section that we have to look at is Berdichi and the elevation around there, because of course Berdichi itself is also a part of the Terny River Valley, which is why its elevation is rather low. But the fields surrounding it to the north and to the northeast, but also northwest, you could say, they are all on relatively high elevation that is overlooking the Semyonivka positions and is on parity basically with the Ukrainian positions located in the ridge to the west of Semyonivka, which is really important because that's where the Ukrainians set up all of their fortifications. And not only would the Russians be on parity, but they'd also be able to flank those positions from the north. So that should be an explanation for why the Ukrainians are currently still holding on to positions in the northern section of Berdichi in order to protect the fields and the high ground to the north of it. Around Orlivka, we don't have updates about fighting on the ground. We only have new videos showing targeting of Ukrainian positions in the village. What we do see the video of the Russian side destroying a Ukrainian T-72 near the southern outskirts, where there was previously fighting, but the Ukrainians were able to reassert control following reinforcements being sent in from the 80th Air Assault Brigade and 3rd Assault Brigade Azov. And so by the Russians opening an attack vector over here, they succeeded in diverting some Ukrainian reinforcements that may have been slated for the Avdiivka sector to be moved to Orlivka. And so that in a way degraded the capabilities of the Ukrainians on the Avdiivka front. At the same time, the Russian forces also ramped up their firing on Ukrainian positions within Orlivka, including on the rail station. That's been a popular Russian target, and so here's another video of such a fab strike. And speaking of these fabs, the Russian forces have recently ramped up their use of the RBK 500 bombs, and so these have cluster anti-tank submunitions, and they are also deployed with the UMPK glide and guidance kits, just like the Fab 500s and 1500s have. And so the first footage of those RBKs being utilized on the battlefield occurred around Staromayorsk in November of 2023. And now we're beginning to see more and more footage of that, especially in open fields and tree lines, which makes a lot of sense in those sort of open areas where you'd have a lot of infantry stationed in a rather dense area. And so that's how the Russians are probably going to be using it. And they can be dropped from a Su-34 using 4 bombs at a time from, again, a pretty long range for the front line. I don't know if it's the same thing as with the Fabs where they can be dropped from like 50, 60 kilometers, but again, they could be launched at an angle where they don't have to be dropped directly above the front line. And speaking of cluster munitions, last week the first shipments from the United States' most recent 300 million security package ended up arriving in Ukraine. And in the first trench of assistance, there were artillery components, including the M864 155 millimeter artillery shells that have DPICM warheads. And so, of course, those cluster munitions that have benefits of their own that we've talked about a lot, but in and of themselves, they're also being used as a way to compensate for Ukraine's shortages and also the West's shortages in general of production when it comes to making and outputting unitary shells of 155 millimeters. And so now, with the backdrop of the United States having commitments to both Israel and Ukraine when it comes to shipments of artillery shells 155 and 120 millimeters, because you have those tank rounds that the Israelis want, and also the fact that the Ukraine aid bill is currently stalling in the House of Representatives, so it's not reaching the Oval Office. With that in mind, the Czech Republic has actually filled the void, and they're announcing that they've located 800,000 possible shells that could be acquired using the funding of European nations. But the Czechs, they admitted that they had, at the moment, serious pledges for, out of those 800,000, 300,000 shells that would come from African and Asian countries, for instance, South Korea. And that would be, in essence, the European nations purchasing those shells from the unused stockpiles of those nations and then from there sending them into Ukraine. So those Czech sources claim that they have serious pledges for 300,000 purchases, but even they say that at the latest, the Ukrainians will receive them by June. So June, that's over 2 months out. And so that in that period of time, you're not going to see an extensive amount of artillery shells being sent into Ukraine unless there is some other shift in EU policy. And so during that period of time, the Ukrainians are really going to have to work hard when it comes to using whatever shells they do currently have at their disposal responsibly, and of course rationing them in a way that could be spread out over that 60, 70 day period of time. At the same time, the Czechs also say that they have 200,000 non-binding pledges, and so again, all of that 500,000 is still considered a pledge. So we're gonna have to wait and see if it actually materializes. But let's say the 300,000 does. If we're looking at the current Ukrainian outputs of around 2,000, then at the moment, really that amount, if it were to start in June, would only be enough to really provide the Ukrainians with enough to continue their current artillery output or slightly increase it throughout the entire summer months, 2 to 3 months, or you could say going into 4 months of actually utilizing 2 to 3,000 shells a day. And so while we're still on the topic of artillery shells, let's look at what happened around Novomykhailivka. There was again a Russian armored column that it attacked from the Zhvarinets fortification system that Russia took control over about a month ago. So they advanced along this attack vector. They were spotted by the Ukrainians and targeted specifically by smart 155s and DPICMs, leading to the direct hit of at least one Russian BTR. And so that video itself, again, it showed the Ukrainians, even though that they do have some shortages, when they do have artillery at their disposal, that's the sort of thing they're able to do with it. And then we saw, again, a minor Russian advance westwards as a result. If we measure it in meters, it's an advance that amounts to around 500, 600 meters westwards. And lastly, over the past few days, the Russians have released an avalanche of footage showing Lancet strikes on Ukrainian targets, specifically around Mykolaiv and Odessa oblasts. And so over those past few weeks, the videos show strikes on 4 boats, 3 radars, and 1 jet. So we'll look through the most recent videos that were released by the Russian side. In the first video, it's from Kobleve, this village that's near Yuzhny. And over there's a Lancet drone. It hits directly a Ukrainian ST-68U, which is a medium-range, low-altitude radar. And so that was, again, a direct hit. In another video released by the Russian side, it's a Lancet that hits a Stenka-class patrol boat near the Odessa port plants. So at the time, it was actually docked along with several other boats in the region. And again, we've seen a lot of these Lancet strikes specifically on Ukrainian targets as they were docked. It's specifically targeting those similar patrol boats. And then lastly, we have a video from the Kubakino airbase, which shows a Lancet hitting the area of an L-39 jet trainer. I don't know if it was destroyed because there was like the tarp over it. So I'm not sure if the explosion in the video is from the fires caused by the tarp or from the jet itself, but either way, it does look like it hit right above it. And when you look at what could be the minimum really stretch for the range of these Lancet drones based on where they could be launched from the front line towards their targets, it looks like it's around 50 kilometers for that strike on the airbase, and then for the ones that are along the coast of the Black Sea, measuring from the Kinburn Spit, it's like 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers. So again, it was previously imagined that the Lancets had like a 40-kilometer maximum range, but it appears that in newer iterations they're reaching 50, 60 kilometers deep into Ukrainian territory. And honestly, these Russian strikes that have recently been occurring, that may be the explanation for why the 73rd Naval Center for Special Operations, which is a part of Ukraine Special Forces, recently launched their raid that attempted to at least land on the Tendra Spit, which is located around here. Of course, we know how that ended with the Russian forces destroying that boat and the special forces located within it. But it would make sense if they were trying to land there in an effort to stymie the Russian efforts from their Lancet crews to launch deep strikes onto the Ukrainian rear. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.